Her current work focuses on developing a curriculum based on performance assessments and what learners should understand, know, and be able to do. She is the current president of the African Language Teachers Association and the vice president of the Senegambian Studies Group. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, I forgot I have this. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I am certainly happy to be here. I'm very glad to be back on the Cornell campus after so many years, which we all know that this COVID pandemic contributed to. We haven't been able to do anything face-to-face or travel. I normally would come to Cornell campus to see my students, but I have one here that is in 4th year and we're just meeting today. So I'm very, very happy to be here. So I thank you for the invitation. I thank the Institute for African Development for their very warm welcome and accommodations and their conversations that I had with them today. So my title is a bit of a misnomer. I am not going to talk about world languages, although I will talk about them, but my focus will be African languages. Will be more in the African language classroom, but much of what I'm going to say will also be relevant for other less commonly taught languages or the lesser studied, less commonly taught languages. So I will begin by speaking about the background of African language teaching in the US, just to set the stage for critical thinking to come into the picture. So I will talk about the growth and professionalization of the field. And for many less commonly taught languages, the teaching started with the 1958 National Defense Act. When this was enacted, Centers for the Teaching of Modern Language, any modern foreign language needed by the federal government or business or industry or education started to blossom in the United States. This led to the availability of fellowships that were targeting particularly PhD students who needed these languages for research in designated areas. You'll see those designated areas on the bottom of the slide there. So several foreign language area studies, these are called NRCs, the National Resource Center, started to budget in the United States, many in African studies. So during the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a growth then in linguists who were specializing in African languages. And this is because the linguistics field still required linguists to be proficient in advanced language study before they do research in these languages. So at that time, the decolonization movement was also going, and the Peace Corps were created. And there was also the civil rights and Black Power movement in the US that fueled interest in these African languages. And so students were very eager to study African languages. At the same time, there was a growth in African studies, in African students coming to the US to study in various fields. So because of that, the Title VI NRC started. This was a convenient and cost-effective way for them to have some African languages taught. So they started recruiting students and have them teach their native language in return for financial support. So these graduate teachers generally had no training in language teaching. They were under supervision of faculty members in the field of linguistics or literature whose connection with language programs was quite loose. They were not determining curriculum. They were not training or deciding which languages were being taught. In a sense, they were there to provide some support to graduate students to be able to teach these languages. And in that context, university level language teaching was far from capable then of providing sufficient language proficiency for field research. But these students that we had in African languages at that time needed the language proficiency for field research. So there was a lack of adequate materials, none whatsoever for some languages. There was no programmatic strategy, and teaching relationship in the US anywhere was not achieving results. So there was hardly a professional field to speak of. Now, this is going to change in the 1980s and 1990s. So programs in African languages got formed, language coordinators came to be, oral proficiency and teaching and testing was worked on, and a national policy on teaching world languages came to be. And also organizations like NCLTICL, the National Council for Less Commonly Taught Languages, and ACTFL started working together. NCLTICL came to be, the African Language Teachers Association also came to be. And so much was going on in terms of growing and professionalizing the field. Among the things that were done, each Title VI center designated a language coordinator, and these language coordinators began to meet annually to work cooperatively to address various issues. Some of these issues included coordinating summer language study abroad, or Fulbright Hays, prioritizing which African languages to teach, and developing the needed learning materials. Also improving language teaching and learning methodology. So proficiency training were very much sustained by the Department of Education, but they came with directives with focus on language proficiency evaluation. So the National Foreign Language Center in 1987 and the African Language Teachers Association in 1988 expanded opportunities for discussion and planning on a national level. So NFLC was mainly concerned with the lack of support for teaching of the less commonly taught languages in the US and the need to develop an effective national policy for the teaching of world languages at large. So they sponsored a series of 3 meetings between 1987 and 89, focusing on professionalization of teaching. And the Title VI resource centers were told to send their language teachers and their language coordinators, of course. So African language programs then, after this series of meetings, hosted their own series of workshops to train instructors in oral proficiency, teaching and testing as developed by the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Language. Now here, I have to note that the language coordinators were not very keen on learning ACTFL ways of testing and teaching. Some of them thought that this is inapplicable to African languages, and others thought it was not useful at all. So despite this you know, what it was, I must say, I don't think they were completely against it, but they had reservations. So despite their reservations, though, the testing methods were widely accepted and implemented across programs and universities in the US. So this series of meetings that were happening in the late 80s gave rise to the foundation of Nickel Tickle in 1990. But prior to Nickel Tickle coming to be, teachers associations like ALTA were formed ahead of time in anticipation that there will be a much larger umbrella organization. Nickel Tickle's goal was to develop ways for these organizations to work together to increase their effectiveness in teaching these languages. So with Nickel Tickle support, ALTA organized other series of workshops to discuss the concept of frameworks for language learning. So language coordinators and other language practitioners who were members of ALTA got together and discussed the concept of which frameworks for language learning, then define the field and develop framework for the most commonly taught African languages. These included Swahili, Hausa, and Yoruba, so task force were formed for those languages, and they came up with guidelines for specific tasks to be mastered at the elementary level courses. So the National African Language Center came to be around this time in 1999 with a 3-year grant from the US Department of Education. So the main activities that the NALRC is expected to conduct are to sponsor workshops to train African language teachers and coordinators at universities nationwide in current methods of teaching and programming, to sponsor training workshops at the ALTA conference, to also provide workshops for the development of African language materials. Yes, and then also promote awareness of the different African languages by producing brochures and materials. I think I skipped over something. Yes, materials development, so production of manuals in the African languages. So this is, during this period, up to the 1999, this is in sum the picture that we have in the development of programs of African languages. So this was largely determined by Title VI priorities, right? Centers for African Studies, not academic departments. There was a loose connection between PALS and other faculty in academic departments. And to a large extent, the teaching of less commonly studied African languages was sustained by graduate students, adjunct faculty, and or language tutorials. So there was a high turnover of faculty. The student body was mostly composed of graduate students. So at this time, there were hardly really any undergraduates in African language classes. The programs focused on graduate student study and did not really provide the opportunity for undergraduates to get engaged in these type of courses. So the popular fields back then were anthropology and history, but there was also a lot of interest coming from the social sciences before the 1990s. Okay, so the professionalization of the field was completely modeled on actual standards. And there was a focus on oral proficiency and testing, and a lack of programmatic and strategy or curriculum design. Okay, so 1990s to 2000, we see some shifts due to various factors. But anyway, teaching shifts to native speakers. And more materials development starts happening, and curriculum design also came to be, away from ACTFL and the national language policy. Oh, I have a double native there. Okay. and the 1980s, what happens, what brought about this shift in native speakers is that students of African languages back in the 1980s were led into theoretical linguistics. So they were encouraged to study Locto. So faculty members at the time heading these programs were recruiting and supervising graduate students while they were teaching an African language program. So they were teaching an African language. So in the 1990s to 2000, many African students who came to the US to pursue degrees in various fields found themselves teaching language in exchange for tuition. And some of these graduate students then stayed back. They stayed in field connected to language, and some of them were pursuing degrees in linguistics and other related fields. So this led to the rise of professional native African language speakers in positions of faculty. So some of the students who remain are now at the head of programs of African languages across the US. So this group of language speakers, because they came in at a time when the National African Language Resource Center was already in existence, and opportunities of training were present, then they benefited from training in pedagogy and materials development from the National African Language Resource Center. They engaged in altar conferences and workshops and began to publish articles in the Journal of African Language Teachers Association. So they were able to secure full-time faculty positions and apply for the available grant for the development of multimedia materials in the less commonly taught languages. They were also able to publish the textbooks that the NARLC was producing. And as leaders of PAL, they were also able to collaborate with the National African Language Resource Center for further development in the field. So these language faculty often hold degrees in the field of linguistics or related areas. This is the case in commonly studied languages as Swahili, Wolof, Yoruba, and Zulu. They have been trained in communicative teaching and are engaged in the production of teaching materials. Some of these faculty actually have been engaged in the production of teaching materials since they were graduate school, sometimes not by choice, but because they didn't have any materials to teach with. So given their training, the materials they produce incorporate the widely accepted standards of teaching and learning developed for African languages based on actual standards and the communicative approach. However, these instructors now have much free rein in deciding content, educational outcomes, and pedagogical approach. So again, under the auspices of NARC, a leadership institute was started. This was specifically directed at program directors and coordinators, so program leaders. So the Leadership Institute was, I think the first one was in 2013. There were subsequently a couple more, but this is the first one that happened, and this is the one I actually attended. Later on, they were called other things, but this was planning for performance, a leadership program for developing high quality programs in African languages. So this institute provided intensive training on curriculum design based on performance assessment and what learners should understand, know, and be able to do. So the premise was understanding by design, also known as backward design. So the institute was conducted by Dr. Jennifer Eddy. And if you want to know more about that particular institute, she had a publication come out of that, and that's what I have at the bottom. So the basic idea for this curriculum design is to use cultural themes, right? Relevance themes, and program leaders get to choose which are the relevant themes that should be covered. If one is, say, learning an African language, or specifically Wolof, for that matter. So these were some of the themes that all of us teaching various African languages agreed that these should be covered, right? So you have an example there of house or home, for example, and under house of home, this is your cultural theme, then you have family, roles, etc. Those things on there are what are called the big ideas. So your big idea is under your cultural theme, and within the cultural theme, you have several big ideas, and you explore them, and you can explore them in a different way at different levels of language learning. So we talked about big ideas already. Now, what goes with each big idea in designing that unit is that you must have enduring understanding, and you must have essential questions. So you have to ask yourself, if I am, now my big idea is friendship, what do my students need to know about friendship? So this will be your enduring understanding. How do you make them get to that understanding? Your essential questions, right? So this is basically the kind of design we followed. And we had to decide, of course, what the learners can do, right? The content, what should or should be taught, and the manner, how the goals of teaching language are achieved. And 3 assessment modes were followed. So each task will have an interpretive, an interpersonal, and a presentational mode, right? So in interpretive mode, it's a one-way communication. Students can listen to something or read and answer questions about it. They could just identify. This could be really pictures even at the elementary level. What do you see? Match the picture to the term or something. And so they, in the interpretive mode, the students acquire new information. They can identify, and they can categorize or infer information. In the interpersonal mode, we aim at two-way communication. So it could be a task where a pair of students get information from each other, or it could be getting information from somewhere else. And you negotiate, you can plan or choose among two things. Now, the presentation mode then will be a one-way communication. So this could be written or spoken, but it is generally prepared, rehearsed, revised, and then presented. The presentational mode uses both interpretive and interpersonal information from interpretive and interpersonal. So after this institute, when I engaged in curriculum design, that when a lot of questions came to my mind. So I started thinking about a whole lot of things, but in particular, these questions. What is my purpose? What is the point of teaching African languages? What is the place of African languages in African studies? What are my students' purposes? What would inspire them to know more about the language and the people? And how could language learning best serve their academic and personal journey? So these are the main things that were going through my head while I am thinking of tasks to incorporate in the design. So, and that also led me to thinking about now, who's learning? Who are my students, right? What is the student body that we have? And why are they learning, right? So we have seen a steady stream of undergraduate students, I will say within the last 15 years or so, more than we had when I first began teaching. No, actually, could be just 10 years when I first started teaching language. So the undergraduate students come to us usually for language requirement. They do not generally continue to advanced level. This is due to the fact that not most programs have only a 4-semester language requirement, some less, but they don't need to continue if they only need this language for the language requirement. They may or may not be interested in African studies, may not have a focus in African studies, but they also come to us because they have been to study abroad. Institutions, have their institution has a study abroad program, either that did not require a language requirement. They went, they came back, and now they have the desire to learn the language. The other part comes because there's a minimal language requirement. They have to take a semester and then go study abroad. You also might get those in the higher levels when they come back. Another growing, so study abroad has, brought in a steady influx of undergraduate students in African language classes. The other category of student that we have that is growing now is heritage learners. The bulk of undergraduate actually now in African language classes are heritage learners. But these heritage learners can also be graduate students who don't really need the language requirement, but are doing this because, like other heritage students, they want to know more about their culture. They want to understand themselves through their culture and linguistic heritage, and they want to communicate with their family or friends. While some of them might take the same opportunity to fulfill a language requirement. And again, they may or may not be African studies students. Now, the graduate students, we still got them from the field that we got them from earlier, except there's a little bit of a change in the student makeup, and also actually this had an influence in numbers. So they come from, from various fields because they're focusing in African studies, and they generally go to advanced level. So they are actually the ones that supply our upper level languages, but they need this language to meet language requirements, to do field work. And so they're more eager to advance to the level where they can actually craft interview questions and, at least speak to people at that level. Again, here, I said this before, but it remains that history and anthropology are the most popular fields, but we have seen a decline in numbers in the last 2 days in the social sciences, especially linguistics, where dominant theories have changed and shifted to the no requirement to extensively know a language to be able to analyze it. You use consultants and use what they know about the language to analyze the language. Other social sciences have moved away, theoretically, from detailed cultural knowledge. So these include political science, economics, and sociology. So we don't see too much of students from these areas. Now, this brings me to African languages and African studies. So what is the place of language in African studies? And this, to put this into context, I will actually address some structural challenges of programs of African languages. So we've seen that considerable progress has been made in the field in terms of professionalizing it, but structural problems remain. African languages, though they are central to the field of African studies and are very important in securing Title VI funding, which is, research, what National African Language Research Centers function on. But there's only one university actually in the US that has a department of African studies. This is Howard University. And guess what? The African language program is not located in that department. It is actually in the world language department. So there's this disconnection that exists. Another university I can think of, it's the University of Madison, which turned its Department of African Languages and Linguistics into an African Cultural Studies department. So African language programs also remained housed in African Studies centers for the most part, and very few programs in African languages find themselves in department, and if they do, it is in interdisciplinary multicultural studies departments, such as the one at Rutgers and Columbia. Rutgers has African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian languages and cultures, and Columbia, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African studies. So no matter what the case is, these PALs exist in a context of replicated marginalization within their departments, often as the only program with no courses beyond advanced and or core departmental courses that require advanced knowledge of language. So if we compare other LCTLs, language programs, they are located in departments that have prerequisites of 2 years of language study to apply for their MA. This is the case of East Asian languages and cultures. These PALs also struggle with being able to offer a representative number of languages to undergraduates and being able to meet the individual needs of graduate students. So graduate students come and decide they're going to study one area in Africa, but their department or their university, because it is the case that they just have to go to the African language program, we don't offer that language. So what do? Yeah? Students choose not to go to universities because they don't offer a certain African language. But here I'm gonna have to stop a bit and give SCI its props. I think part of this problem is being addressed by collaborative initiatives such as the SCR. We're able to to offer a greater number, a greater varied number actually of African languages. Okay, so in that context of structural problems that need solutions, and we don't have them, and we still have African studies programs in many universities, and not having the academic support that is there. We need to do something about filling the gap between this lack of so-called content courses and the language courses. So let's take a look at actually what is African studies? What are students in African studies doing, right? What is this discipline? This discipline, simply defined, is the systematic scientific study of African peoples and their institutions, their culture, their history, etc. But because of the presence of global Africa is an indisputable reality, African studies is also about diaspora African identities. Language study, however, is still at the periphery on this enterprise. It's still at the periphery of mainstream African studies teaching and research activities. The interdisciplinary nature of African studies and the orientation of the social science research makes it hard to devise articulated programs that integrate in-depth language study in a meaningful way. So this situation leaves a gap between language and so-called content courses. Now, in studying phenomena about African people, or any people for that matter, we use critical tools, categories and concepts, not reality, but defined categories and constellations of concepts in the languages that we have. And when we define phenomena through language, we do many things, but importantly, we describe using categories with the tools we have that we find representative of reality. Again, not reality itself. We use language that has its own formalized taxonomy. And we deal with humanly constructed institutionalized facts. Now, at that level of language, it is very important that we be aware that there is a difference when we use a different language because of culture. I think okay. So therefore, language has to be central to African studies, because any discourse in African studies that overlooks the role and place of language would be incomplete. Language is the means through which a speech community has formalized its system of knowledge and understanding of the world around it. And in their quest to understand and theorize Africa, students of African studies do not generally have the opportunity to engage in discourse at that level in the African language of concern because of the lack of so-called content courses in which they can learn, understand, and use terms in their own context that they are using in another language to describe Africa. Now, to redress this situation, then, we African language practitioners have to think about filling this gap. We cannot teach language to teach language, to teach communication. We have to go beyond that. This is not mutually exclusive with the enterprise of teaching communicatively, but we have to think beyond that. Right? We must give students the opportunity to a deeper understanding of the language they are learning and a deeper understanding of the people through their language. So in my mind, teaching African languages has to be about critical teaching. Now, what critical teaching do I talk about? There's a plethora of definitions of critical thinking, and there is hardly a wide consensus on any one of them. I am not going to go through the differences between definitions, but for my purpose, I will tell you what I mean by critical thinking. I simply mean to raise learners' awareness and enable them to examine language input critically and think about vocabulary choice, sentence form, and meaning. And to ask critical questions with an N, right? Critical questions with the tool of language given to them in the language. And these questions should lead them to think deeper than the surface of things, using background cultural knowledge, to examine what they are taking for granted based on their own values and beliefs, and to examine their own perspective and consider other relevant viewpoints. So in the elementary level, you were probably thinking, how do you do this in the elementary level? You can't do much with it, but you can do something, right? Most of the background knowledge is in L1, in the culture notes. I actually do write extensive culture notes in the elementary level in anticipation of building on them. So the tasks have to be very simple, really. Something they can perform at level. So this is, you can't read, but this is part of my cultural note on family. So it's there's a lot of information in there. So I will show you the elementary level, one of the designs on family. And so you have the enduring understandings, which are the things students need to know. So one of them, I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of them is family is wealth from God. This is from a Wolof proverb, right? Mok, hallelujah. And family doesn't mean nuclear family. I mean, these are things that are important because our students, what they know, the notion of family is just the nuclear family. So some of the essential questions that we can ask is, what is family relationship? What is your responsibility to your family members? To what extent do family roles contribute? So these essential questions actually should be answered in these grammar notes. Not grammar notes, but culture notes. So this what you need your students to know and possibly question and try to understand should figure in your background sort of knowledge that you give them. So a task to give to elementary level is they have a short piece of writing. Student studying abroad writes to a friend in the US describing her host family. So they read, and in the interpretive mode, they answer questions about family members and their relationship. Then in the interpersonal mode, in pairs, students ask each other questions about their family. And in the presentational mode, each student parent presents the other family to the class. Now, what you can add to it to make this sort of a bit within the frame of critical teaching is that you make students read the grammar notes and they write a short paragraph comparing typical families in Wolof society and in the US. And you ask them to include two important differences regarding terms of reference. There is quite a bit of difference that needs to be understood there. So some of the terms are here. If you go through them, you can see that there is a particular term for a paternal aunt, right? And a particular term for a maternal uncle different from, you know, the paternal uncle. And there are two notions of cousins. And all of these are representative of societal roles that actually are very, very important and values in the society. Okay, so I think maybe I won't go through the intermediate level. I'll tell you a little bit about what I do in the fourth year, which is directed studies, as I see there's very little time left. So the supervised reading, right, fourth year or directed studies, normally students and I kind of draw up a plan. And this is sort of our line of inquiry this semester is these things. It's what is decolonization through some of the existing literature as translated into or composed in Wolof? What is the meaning of Blackness and its semantics in Wolof? Reflections on the semantics of colonization and independence. So we compare sort of what ideas are behind terms like Nortel as opposed to Monsabop, Monsareo, Tinkiku, etc. So in independence in Wolof, you express it as owning your own head or owning your country, right? And independence is something like Tinkigu coming out from a position of being what is that verb in English? What do you do when you tie an animal's legs? There's a term. Feather, what is it? Feather or something? Yeah, that. So having to think about these things, yeah? So we form a reading list. Among our reading lists are, we were lucky to have Césaire in Wolof, so Nawe to that, but we also wanted to include Fanon, right? And so Fanon is being read in English. And what we do with it is we select passages and we translate, or students translate, they bring it, and we have a discussion over the translation and the choice of terms. Oh, my battery is dying, but I'm going to wrap it up with giving you a student's response to what we are doing. And this was a response on the discussion of historical concepts such as the transatlantic trade, colonization and decolonization. Students said, because of the deliberate engagement that students had concerning different vocabulary in Wolof, the class engaged in a conversation distinguishing the concept of the native in Frantz Fanon's text, The Wretches of the Earth. Not only did we, as a class, engage what was meant by Fanon's use of the terms when choosing a word in Wolof to describe people of the Caribbean were, and those who were displaced to the transatlantic slave trade. don't want this to die on me. The distinction between jambetsi, literally, to plant, root, here, but away from the origin, from wherever you got that thing that you planted here. As opposed to sankasi, to lose or disconnect, also away from origin, allowed us to enter into the implications of determinism rhetoric concerning the diaspora, and by extension, larger discourses of Afro-pessimism and positivism. However, having the discussion in Wolof ensured that students were learning and thinking about the concept critically and choosing their own positionality to be their own history actively. For some, this may be the first time that they actually consider the difference between these concepts. Said the student whose head hurts after Wolof class. So I will wrap it up here. Thank you for your attention.
So at this point, we are happy to take questions for our online audience. Please simply put them in chat. For everybody else here in the audience, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Thank you, Mariam, for a very interesting background on African languages and the teaching in this country. This was really fascinating. So to get going, actually, one question that I had, you just showed us for the elementary level some of the essential questions that you are contemplating, that you're asking your students to think about. And I'm wondering, with the example for what is family relationship, for example, are you asking students to address these questions in English, in the target language, or are these essential questions something that guides your determination of what materials you present in class?
Well, they do guide that, but I can also ask some essential questions.
Mhm.
So in the elementary level, could be I give them a family tree, and there is a paternal uncle and and a brother, and there's a maternal uncle, and I could say, Bill, nijayo, Maimuna. It's Bill Maimuna's uncle, but I'm using maternal uncle. Of course, the
Interesting, yeah.
answer would be no. Bill Papo Maimuna, that's the father. He is also a father. He's not an uncle. So very simple questions like that to make them notice these differences.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have questions here in the audience or on Zoom? So there is, do you want to?
Yes, so Mijang would like to know, to promote students' critical thinking, do you recommend students to create discussion questions, or do you generate them yourself and guide them?
Not both happens. So I do generate questions, especially when it has to do with use of terms. So of course, because sometimes I do have a deeper understanding of the word, and that drives the questions that I put to them. But between them, they also use discussions. So they can, in the discussion sessions, we use Canvas for discussion this week. We did quite a bit of in the advanced level. They also put questions to each other. They give a position also about an issue and then ask a question to the class.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions in the audience or online? So there's lots of thank yous rolling in, Mariam, for your talk. Let's go to Bill here.
As you were presenting it, Mariam, as you were talking, I was wondering in terms of the materials for the higher level classes, have you looked at and brought over any of the materials being produced in Wolof in Senegal? Because I know there are a lot of NGOs producing a lot of material now, translating books that were originally written in French into Wolof and that kind of thing. Is that part of your
Yes.
curriculum or not?
So we started using, some of the books that have been translated, all the classics of Senegalese literature. So I'm using now, beginning from advanced level. Uh, but there's very specific stuff that I've used in the past, and this is depends on my students' interest, right? So there's all this stuff that has been produced on maternal health and all of that. So if my students are in public health and doing maternal health or whatever, I go to those materials. So teaching supervised readings from year to year is teaching a different course every time almost. So it's, yeah, but I do tap into that available material.
So we have one question online. What inspired you to teach less commonly taught languages? In your opinion, what is the most difficult part of learning a less commonly taught language?
That's a difficult question and a loaded one. What inspired me to teach a less commonly taught language? I must say, so I began kind of my career getting into theoretical linguistics. I did not think I would end up teaching language. I was very much into linguistic theories and breaking down language and collecting data and explaining it. Not that I'm not still, passionate about that, but it so happened that I am one of those people who, it's by in teaching Wolof is how I got through grad school. It was paying for my schools. And while doing that and thinking about this and having to produce material and I'm writing, I got completely fascinated with the language. And I started saying to myself, you are a fool. You're interested in analyzing, European languages. You're interested in doing all of this, and you have this wonderful language that is yours. And that's when I actually learned to write this language. I've never studied it before, and this is where my passion comes from. And I'm like, I can't believe we're not doing anything with this beautiful language. So that's really what kind of turned me to it. Is Wolof or some other less commonly taught languages, are they harder to learn? Well, I mean, possibly.
I think not harder, just the most difficult part. That was
Oh, the
question.
most difficult part. Okay. In the group of languages that I deal with, the morphology, the inflection. The inflection is the most hard part to learn. The system of conjugation is extremely extensive. It is information bound. So depending on what you're saying, you use different subject markers. And these different subject markers are called paradigms. You have to learn them in every person. And a lot of the verbal morphology also changes the meaning of words. So you almost have to teach your students to recognize roots and then also know the meaning of these little parts. So that's kind of, that is a difficulty. Yeah.
Thank you. So being mindful of the time, I do want to ask one more question that we have here in chat. If students have some biased opinions, do you challenge them or accept them as a diverse opinion?
Another difficult one. I mean, I don't just discount what they think right off the bat. If I know this comes from somewhere, it's a bias because there's somewhere that they don't understand in the culture, I try to stir them towards that, but I do not force it on them. They have to, get this information and come to their own conclusion. Aha, this is why, this cannot be read like this, right? So, I mean, I'm sure Jabari is here. You remember the whole religious thing with Isi in class. So yeah, these things happen. but I don't force my opinion on students, although they may have biased ones.
Great. Well, please help me in thanking Mariam for her wonderful talk this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us here in person and for everybody online. And we very much look forward to seeing all of you at our spring series. We're in the process of finalizing that. Topics will be up on our website soon. So thank you very much. Enjoy your evening and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you all for coming.